So we have a very interesting panel here, and it's about payments innovation. We started with a great keynote, and we are continuing on this conversation. Payments, right? Innovation. I mean, who would guess that payments, right, is the biggest merger and acquisition, ongoing, more and more talks about that. Then you got, of course, the cybersecurity issues that links to that, right? And there's so many things that we can talk about that. So with me here is very exciting from Airbnb. Okay, Michel, right? Michel, would you like to introduce yourself and talk a bit what you're doing? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Michel Weksler. I'm a software engineer at Airbnb. I'm focusing on payments, and I've been at Airbnb for a little over 5 years. I worked in the payments industry before Airbnb at several large companies in Silicon Valley and also at a few fintech startups. And at Airbnb, I focus on making sure that money keeps moving. I sometimes tell people that I'm like a plumber, electronic one. I just make sure that there are no leaks, that all the pipes just are connected, and that things just keep flowing.
Interesting to use the plumbing illustration. I'm just thinking how you're going to. Yeah, okay. Anyway.
It's the water that comes in. Yeah.
And Pat's very exciting from W Capra, and really a lot of tremendous experience in retails, right, and payments. Would you like to share with us what you do and what W Capra is? Yeah.
Yeah, Pat Raycroft with W Capra. We are a professional services firm based out of Chicago, and to Rachel's point, we focus on merchant and merchant acquirers and advising them on just what Michel stated, right? Keeping the pipes and the plumbing running properly from a payments perspective. So we focus on everything from payments, loyalty, offers, as well as store and corporate operations related to payments in the front end commerce experience. And then lastly, cybersecurity, payment fraud, loyalty fraud, and most notably, when it was a very relevant conversation earlier, data privacy and how all these programs are rolling in together. So that's been, that's a bit of an overview on our firm.
Okay. So in your views about why is it so suddenly such a great interest in terms of payments, right? You see a lot of merger and acquisitions, right, going on in this space. In your opinion, what is driving all this interest and innovation?
There's a lot of money there, I think. Frankly, there's a lot of money there, and there's also, especially stateside, and in North America, I'll talk to that in particular, it is rife for disruption at the moment. I think if you look globally, there was a reference earlier to, the innovation that's happening specifically in the Asian markets, and a bit of a disintermediation of consumers and banks and new challengers to the space. I think especially stateside, there's a really, everyone sees a massive opportunity to disrupt the status quo of what has, in some sense, stifled innovation, in payments innovation in the U.S. The status quo of the merchant acquirers, card brands, and the issuing banks behind them. So I would say it's a combination. The money was always there, but I think the longer the time has gone on, there's a really big opportunity here for disruption and for new players to come into the space. And again, given the size of the market, I think that's driving a lot of the acquisitions and changeover.
Okay. Michel.
And Michel, I agree with you that it's a very exciting time to be in the payments business right now. There's a lot of activity and acquisitions, as you pointed out, but I actually don't think it's anything new. I think this has been going on for quite a while. I remember when I joined PayPal in 2002, in beginning of 2003, the PayPal was already an innovator and was trying to disintermediate, the banks and trying to crack open this and that. And, all those things that we hear today, which are still true, they were happening back then. PayPal was trying to move money between Palm Pilots to start with, for those of you that still remember those fun little devices. So I think it's been going on for a long time because the payments industry in this country is very distributed. There's a lot of players, and they all are, entrenched. But I think even globally, as you think about, each country viewing payments as a key part of its sovereignty, right? It's protective. So you end up with lots and lots of different payment methods and regulations and different laws and rules that you have to abide by, and that is difficult. You have to go one country at a time. It's hard to do things that work globally everywhere.
Right. Yeah. And so let us go back to last Christmas, right? 2018, all right? So, Michel, by the way, you want to sing with me the George Michael Last Christmas song? I'm just kidding. But,
Sure, we can give it a try.
Why not we sing
After,
that, right?
for drinks, maybe later.
And for the last Christmas, what is the surprising thing that you're seeing? Because we are getting into Thanksgiving, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and in fact, I also have another question is about like the Singles Day, like the billions of dollars Alibaba rip, right? And what does it mean? What are the biggest surprise last year, right, and compared to this year, right?
I would say
This year, I don't think that it has come
Yeah,
yet.
yeah.
So,
But
what was the biggest surprise?
I would actually almost argue that it wasn't much of a surprise at all. It was kind of following the trend of a rise in m-commerce and e-commerce sales, which had been following a similar trajectory. And I think when you compare it to Alibaba Day and they did in the first hour the amount that Amazon did in all of Amazon Prime Day, right? So the volume of sales in an hour. So I think almost what we're seeing versus the global comparisons, right? If I look to Black Friday, Cyber Monday, is that they're not blowing up in any significant sense. They're kind of following the trends that we would expect. The overall volume staying rather consistent, right? Growing with GDP, and we're seeing the same trends of shifting gradually to m-commerce and e-commerce. From our clients' perspective, I would say the thing that we are seeing in the background, not in consumer trends, but from what retailers are focusing on, is they're bringing in this is really related to, I think, Joe, your talk, right? They're bringing in the concept of, we've been terming it as operational integrity, right? So that's really beyond just the typical availability, resiliency conversation, but it loops in cybersecurity and asset and loss prevention aspects into a single view and a conversation and a lens into what is the health of my operations, both technically, procedurally, et cetera. So we're seeing clients. There's always been Black Friday and the holiday prep and peak season prep and all that things, but it's actually taken what I have noticed is a more advanced step towards what I would say is a healthy operational integrity approach for some of these large retailers. That's probably my biggest note from 2018, 2019, and beyond.
Excuse me, some technical issue. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think it's interesting also to see how the fluctuation in traffic, is different when you're a retailer that focuses on, selling things and goes by the Black Friday and or Prime Day or whatever it may be, or if you're selling vacation stays, right? I think the traffic patterns look slightly different, but as you can imagine, a lot of people travel over the holidays, so that's definitely true for Airbnb as well.
Interesting. So when we think about innovation in the retail era, retail is there's a lot of complexity involved, right? Yeah, it's a supply chain and the acts of the payment itself and the customer relationship and everything linked together. In your opinion, Pat, what get you excited, in this era? What are you seeing trends that you must tell us now, right now, right, that we should know? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I said it to Henry. The thing I would love to see in 5 to 10 years is no front of store point of sale. I just don't. I think that concept is aging itself out, and retailers hang on to that concept as, that's part of our experience, that's part of our engagement. But consumers are really directing the other way, right? They want to engage through their own devices. They want consumer device driven checkout. They want delivery. They want the convenience, right? And that's just not a convenient factor. That's one. And I would say where retailers are focusing is personalization heavily, which we'll probably get into the data privacy component here because consumers are talking out of both sides of their mouth at the moment because they want these personalized experiences, which requires a lot of data to be gathered on them, especially their profiles and habits. And then they sit there and they vote for, well, I want the ability, you shouldn't be collecting any of my data, and if you do, I want to be able to delete it, or I want to know what you have on me. It's a little bit of a catch-22 for some of these retailers. I don't know if I'm excited about that, but we're having to deal with that a lot in retail.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I remember reading a lot of articles about PayPal and also Walmart last Christmas, and about combining in-store and online experience. And just now you mentioned you being a plumber, right? Now let me ask you, I mean, how is it going to be different? Do you experience something like all this strategy, right, affecting Michel, you are the plumber, you're the guy doing the job,
Yeah.
How do you feel like, does it have any impact on
So I
your
think
work?
and I don't know if this is the direction you're asking, so please let me know, but I think some of the new technologies that are emerging are primed to change the way payments take place, online and offline. I think the few trends that I see kind of converging, one of them is the convergence of online and offline. So basically, more and more you will start to use your phone, your device, to pay in the real world. We see that with Apple Pay and Google Pay right now. Imagine that in more and more places, at the pump, or at the toll plaza, at the parking garage, everywhere. So that's one thing. Another thing is the increasing adoption of strong authentication mechanisms. Think of Face ID or Touch ID or YubiKeys that we have here, and secure computing environments, or whatever the technology is, but security-minded elements and authentication mechanisms, and support for that in the payments networks. So with those three, you can start to see things like the no checkout point of sale. You can start to see automated payments that happen just by you being somewhere, right? You can get charged if you agree, if you give your consent. You can start to see micropayments happening, and maybe it's using something like what Coil presented earlier or something else. So I think all those things are converging right now. It's going to take some time for them to sort of come together, but I definitely see those coming together.
Interesting. So in terms of emerging technologies and the trend, right, that where this is going, right? So, well, I hate to fast forward to 2029 Christmas, right? Because I hate to miss so many Christmas. But what do you think that the emerging trends are really going towards?
Yeah, going back to the no point of sale concept, I think something that's going to be fairly ubiquitous. So Amazon Go presented a potential way to the future. They invested a lot of money into developing that technology. There are other technology platforms out there that are challenging it as well. So that concept, to me, is exciting, right? Of taking and really transforming what brick and mortar retail has become and kind of stagnated to over the last 20, 30, 40 years. So I think immediate 2029 will look something along those lines. In the nearer term, I think Karen mentioned it, I think we're going to see a severe retraction in the mobile app world, the native mobile app world. There's just too many out there. Everyone thinks, for a type of retailer that has spend every 2, 3, 4, 6 months, a consumer's not going to download your mobile app, and if they do, they're going to delete it immediately after when they use it. There's not any staying power. The people that should have mobile apps are Starbucks and Dunkin'. Like that makes a lot of sense because I use my Starbucks app on a daily basis. I think the thing we're going to see is a diversion away from, and this is really tying back to the W3C and everything they have working on the payments side. We're going to see a diversion over into progressive web apps, as Karen alluded to, and really slick and I would say interesting ways of getting users into that experience, and potentially that funnels into users downloading the mobile app if it becomes a more frequent spend. But I think the progressive web app evolution is really coming, and it's heavily dependent on things like the W3C payments work that are going on in order to be seamless. That's kind of in the near term, and then over time, I think that checkout experience changes, gets closer to the no checkout concept, and things of the like.
Interesting. Michel?
Yeah, and I think those are all good points. And just to add to that, and I hate to try and predict, what will be in 10 years. I don't feel like that's quite, what I'm capable of doing. But again, going back to the convergence of technologies that I talked about earlier, and if we add things like web authentication and web payments to the mix, I think the emergence of payments and authentication as very, very close and maybe, the same thing might be something that happens. I don't know if it'll happen in the next 10 years. Maybe it'll take longer.
Yeah.
But, you can already see the early signs of that people are using very similar technologies and essentially the same technologies. I think in Australia, one of the states in Australia already has an ID that can be downloaded to your phone that basically relies on very similar technology as the technology that's used by Apple Pay or Google Pay. So I think those two things will become much, much closer. I don't know if it'll happen in the next 10 years though.
Yeah, it's interesting. Related to earlier the session, identity, privacy, and also security, right? Basic security, all these issues, right? How do you think that it's going to evolve, right?
Yeah, I think that the basic building blocks are what we're missing at the moment. Those are coming with the likes of the YubiKey and web authentication and strong authentication mechanisms. And as those become more prevalent, I think then the question is going to be, okay, now given those building blocks, how do we build something that provides for both a secure form of payment and authentication, but also privacy protecting, which is exactly the consumers are speaking from two sides of their mouth. I think that is a realistic thing. Like, people want that, right? They want at the same time to be able to do seamless secure payments and authentication and not be tracked, right? And I think it can be done. The technology exists. We just need to build using the right building blocks and do it in the right way, which at the moment we are not able to do, right? So I think that's the biggest change that I think is coming. It's going to have to come because consumers are not going to change their minds just because we tell them to, right? This is what people want, and we have the technology exists for that. We just need to make it available to everyone, evolve the standards to the point where that can be done.
So, in terms of architecture and design, and you're talking about that, right? So I will ask how both of you see in terms of architectural design that there are innovation like for payments, right? Like how you see it.
That's a good question. Definitely a lot to it. So kind of unpack it in areas. I think we've hit on the concept of standards and APIs, throughout this, right? I think the days of proprietary point-to-point interfaces, especially focused on payment, are over. And if they continue payments will continue to be stifled. So, I mean, I think that's just kind of a blanket foundation that everything has to be built upon. I think some of the things, taking a step back from just payments, really, our retail clients are, at least the ones that are focusing on the future, are talking about broader consumer data and how they're going to be managing and processing it across their systems. You know, a lot of them are looking to, we talked about, you know, trustless organizations. Somebody, you know, I think Stefan hit on that earlier, or Michel. And I think organizations are looking to third-party providers as that true data processor. And to me, there is a piece missing here, which is, okay, you can just shift and transfer all of that risk of the data you're collecting, not just payment data, but all of the consumer profile information, all of their identifiers, all their commercial information. You can shift all that and transfer all that risk to your third parties, but it still hasn't solved the problem. It still hasn't solved the problem with like basic privacy first building blocks of how do I anonymize the data in a meaningful way so that it truly reduces that risk. I think that's the big missing piece as it relates to payments, and again, more broadly, consumer data that's collected in commerce, is to focus on not just shifting the data to third parties, which has been the trend for the last 5 to 10 to 15 years. I mean, that's what encryption and tokenization are, is just shifting it to your acquirer, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that we haven't fundamentally viewed how do we devalue the data itself. And until we get to that point, I think we're going to run into serious challenges with both cybersecurity and privacy that will lead to either bad events or some limitations on pace of change.
Interesting. Michel?
Yeah, I think I agree with what you said. And to add to that, I think as I look at the web payments work that is happening at W3C and reflect on all the innovation that's happening in the payments space in general, I think there's still room to grow. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the work right now is focused on problems that primarily exist in Europe and North America. I think India and China have a very, very interesting payments ecosystem that is very, very active. There's a lot of innovation there, and it's all online. But there's not been as much activity around standardizing it as there has been with North America and European problems. And that's one of the challenges that I see, and really the exciting opportunities, though. That I see is, I can see a lot of that innovation coming online and coming to the W3C because there is a need to standardize it. Right now, for example, WeChat Pay and Alipay are not interoperable, right? There are some issues there that, I think the government also doesn't necessarily want that to happen, but I think, there's still an underlying problem of there is no standard also for Paytm or generally in India. So I think that's a big opportunity that I see for standardization.
It's interesting. So actually, I want to come back to Michel on this because you have worked so much on the payments working group, right? And will you share with us what's your experience has been? I know that it has been a great experience. And what do you think that you yourself have contributed to all the standards, right? And how do you feel about all this work that you have done? I mean, it's a long while you have been.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think generally, standards work is fascinating. I think being able, it's the art of influence without authority, right? No one has authority over anyone else, and you gotta convince people to do or not to do, what you want, and they try to convince you of the same stuff. And it's an interesting dynamic, which is, I think, very different for me, at least, having spent most of my career in corporate America, where, it's much easier to just do things if you decide to do them and someone higher up decides to do them, right? So I think that's one aspect that's really interesting in general about standards work. I think another thing that people always say about standards work is that it takes longer. than you expect, and I think that's true. But again, for good reason. You have to get a lot of different companies aligned, and it takes time, and each has their own schedule, so you have to be patient. I think with regard to the Web Payments Working Group, one of the things that I feel Airbnb brings to the table is the perspective of merchants. I don't think there's that many merchants active in the working group, and that is sometimes again an opportunity for more merchants to be present. I think there are many cases where the working group will contemplate a change or a new feature or a new idea, and then people ask, well, what do merchants think? And then, as the only merchant representative in the room, I get to say what merchants think, which I think is maybe putting too much responsibility on one person or one organization, because I think Airbnb is a very specific kind of merchant and doesn't necessarily represent all merchants. So I think I welcome more merchants' participation in the Web Payments Working Group. I think we will all benefit from it.
Yeah, I believe that for this, I don't want to put words into my dear friend and colleagues, Karen Meyer's mouth, but I know that she and a lot of people in W3C are making effort to bring in merchants' presence, right? And I think that will be a lot of great interaction that you want to see there. Yeah. So, Pat, you mentioned about progressive web, right? And how do you see that some of the work that is needed, both for standards work, standardization, or some of the innovation that you see that will be happening in progressive web? Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually talking with Michel about this earlier. Actually, a lot of the foundation is there. I mean, the building blocks are actually there. So I actually think the progressive web app movement is more a matter of a question of when, not if. I mean, I think from all the work that W3C and payments and even more broadly have done over the last several years. And Karen, you talked a lot about look and feel, and the actual interaction within progressive web apps is we can make it nearly identical to native mobile apps, especially as 5G coverage expands. That the introduction of 5G is really a key point for a lot of these or a lot of the data intensive progressive web apps, whereas a native mobile app might have had an advantage because of the data that's stored locally and processed locally within that mobile app. So I think the last building block is going to be network. Right, so I think 5G is going to be key for a lot of the more data-intensive progressive web apps. But the foundation, the backend systems and pipes, for again pulling out a term, have actually already been built out for a lot of merchants because their native mobile apps are already using that technology in the backend. So it's actually just a different way in the front door. So I think it's there. The next final question outside of everything from a technology standpoint that needs to be done is when will merchants acknowledge that is something they should be doing? We have these conversations all the time. They've invested a lot of money and a lot of time into building these native mobile apps, and there's a lot of pride behind them. And we're seeing these statistics that are driving a narrative of it might not have been the best strategy for you. So we're kind of getting through that struggle, I would say, industry-wide at the moment. And once we get over that hurdle, then I think you'll start to see introduction of more progressive web apps from the retail side.
Interesting. So let's go back to the global payment, right, the scenario. How do you see, and maybe we can start with Michel. Do you see, it's dealing with so many different countries you're dealing with. How do you work on all these requirements? And I mean, just give us some imagination, right, into your world, right? Mm-hmm. Do people just say, oh, Brazilian wants this, and then Chinese want this, and Americans want this? How do you deal with all these requirements?
I think it's a great question, and there's no magic here. A lot of it ends up being prioritization, like I'm sure everyone does, right? Because in the software industry, you always have more work to do than people to do it, right? So you have to be, strategic about how you prioritize. And I think that's how we choose to prioritize, again, is not anything magical. I think...
Are they very different, the user requirements
and
from
I think-
models? Are they very...
I think the main, or not the main, but maybe one important part is that, Airbnb's mission is to create a world where anyone can belong anywhere.
Yes.
And I think that drives a lot of the thinking around it because, Airbnb does have a lot of integrations in many, many places around the world because it is desirable to have guests be able to pay using a local payment method and hosts be paid using a local payment method. It's not necessary, right? You can do business without having those integrations, but I think it's a more delightful experience and it's more useful for everyone, and also it makes business sense. So I think everything aligns in that way, and that's the best kind of prioritization where all the things you're trying to optimize for kind of align. Right? Of course, that's not always the case, and sometimes people need to make tough decisions. But I think that's again not unique.
Interesting. All right, Pat. So going into global payments, right? So the Singles' Day, right? $35 billion, right? Alibaba, and they say that, there are other people trying to get into the Singles' Day market, right? And, but Alibaba is still the winner, right? So my question is that how do people, just ordinary merchants and ordinary people, ordinary companies tap into this lucrative Singles' Day market, right? Given... And, without going, everybody knows what's going on. There are very big difference between the way we do business, right, in the countries, right, in both countries, right. So this is the first question. And second question is that, do you really think that, in the retail space, right, the cross-border payments, right, how is it evolving? Like given the shadow of like trade war and everything. So it's a heavy duty question. I'm sorry. I'm
two of them.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
Yeah. So two questions. Yeah.
Yeah. The first one, I think the ability for Alibaba and Amazon to pull off what they pull off is really an effect. I don't think when any of our retail clients think about that, right? It's the question can't start with how do we get to achieving that type of engagement from our consumer base. It has to start well before that because Alibaba and Amazon have built this consumer ecosystem unlike anything else that retail clients have generated. So I have to, I would almost, most of our retail clients, I challenge them if they say, that's something we strive for, that's something we want to get to. I almost challenge them to say, well, does your business model support getting to something like that, right? And to be honest, most don't because you have to create such a closed ecosystem, not closed, a comprehensive ecosystem of commerce, right? You need to have that marketplace that only those two are bringing at that scale to the globe. I would say most of our retail clients are not going down that route, and they're acknowledging that it's a different business model than they're willing or capable or whatever their limitation may be to support to get to that.
Interesting.
So it's question one and question two one more time.
Actually,
Cross-border.
Cross-border, yeah, cross-border.
Thank you, Michel. I forgot about my question.
Cross-border has been and I'm sure with Michel as well, has been a massively popular topic across payments. Cross-border comes with a whole bunch of payment-related things, right? Dynamic currency conversion, local currency as it relates to the regulation of which gateways can process with which banks in which countries. We're getting better at solving that. Service providers are getting better at solving that. The world pays to the world, right? Stripes, Braintrees, et cetera. I would say the area that is struggling the most with cross-border payments is payment fraud. And that has been probably the most relevant and hot topic related to cross-border payments has been every country has its, a different different data that's going to be provided, different habits. So we at W Capra, we manage fraud operations for one of our clients, and we manage it in various aspects of the globe. And I'll use two in particular because most people would think they're pretty close, U.S. and U.K. So their fraud trends in the U.K., are very predictable, right? It's much more structured, less fraud as a total percentage of volume. And then you get to the U.S. and things go AWOL. And they're not anywhere near close. You can't even take a single trend in the U.K. and map it to the U.S. So cross-border fraud has been challenging with cross-border payments because if you're accepting payments from various regions and you have a fraud engine that's sitting in the background trying to accommodate for all these various users across various regions, you run into a pretty significant challenge. And to be honest, it becomes pretty financially taxing on accepting cross-border payments. So a lot of people are struggling with just the basics of, can I keep my cross-border payment functionality? Can I be accepting international payments on my digital commerce sites? So I would say that's probably the number one biggest issue at the moment, and we're getting better. I think there's a lot of tools and providers that are coming in the industry, a lot of knowledge, but still a hot topic.
Yeah, that's it's I regarding cross-border, I think you're absolutely right. It's one of those challenges that you can't really solve in sort of one silver bullet, right? You have to solve it one country at a time. But I think the opportunity there is huge. Cross-border has traditionally been something that very few companies did, and they charged, through the nose for it. And as more and more disruptors showed up, and online companies started getting involved, I think you saw the fees go down dramatically, and until you have today, some companies, I think TransferWise is the one that comes to mind, that basically they charge literally nothing. Like, they have a small fee, they're very transparent about it, and it's basically as cheap as it gets, and they are trying to solve this, I think, fraud problem that you're describing, most likely. But I think the opportunity there is huge because people, travel, people work and send money home. There's all sorts of reasons why people want to move money across borders, and it's traditionally been really, really hard. It's still harder than it should be, I think, but it's getting easier and cheaper, and that's a good trend.
My company actually experienced something about this, the fraud, and the person, right, or the group, right, that they use the WeChat, right, and they put a lot of Chinese and they impersonate my company, and
and
it's really quite interesting.
When it comes to fraud, I think that's another really, really interesting aspect of online payments processing.
Yes.
Is that fraud is an industry in and of itself,
True.
right?
Yeah.
There are people out there, lots of them, that go to work every day, they sit at their desk, and they do fraud all day, and they go home to their wife and kids, or to their husband and kids, and they have dinner and all that stuff. That's their work, right?
No,
and that is the reality.
Michel, thanks.
That is the reality of fraud in this online world we live in. It's just another industry. It's of course a shadow industry. It's not maybe reported on in the same ways, but it definitely is industrialized. It's not just some random hacker in a basement somewhere just trying to hack your website.
This is just a fun example. It is most definitely an industry, and this one really opened my eyes. It was a few years back. We were engaged with a client. So they were in quick service restaurants, so keep that in mind. So the fraud ring that was underway, so they eventually engaged the authorities, et cetera. Everything went out. They went to a house in the middle of, call it Pennsylvania. And they went to a house, and they were raiding the house because the house had shipped a bunch, thousands of dollars worth of electronic goods to the Ukraine. They went to the house, and it was a single mom with a family of 4 sitting in the house. They were like, well, this doesn't add up. Why are you sending thousands of dollars to an address in the Ukraine? So it turned out, against this QSR client, they had a fraudster sitting in the Ukraine, was earning the trust of this single mother of 4 by buying them and her and her family meals with stolen credentials and having them delivered to her house. So they would earn the trust of the given family, and then on the 5th delivery of food, they would say, hey, could you please send this box that I'm going to have sent to your house, because you can't send electronics outside the U.S. if you buy in the U.S. So they would have them shipped to this house, and the house would reship them back out to the Ukraine. That is really contrived to pull this off. I mean, that took weeks, months, time. That's the type of fraud, and it wasn't even the electronics company that was the one that found it out, right? It was the quick service restaurant company. So that was one of my favorite fraud stories of all time, because I had to think through that one about 5 times about how somebody thought that was normal, that somebody random was calling them and shipping them food. But
Yep.
That's interesting. So they have like CTOs, CFOs, and
I'm sure they do.
project management.
I'm sure they do, and they also,
Timeline,
they also bitch and
timeline
moan
to
about the
reach.
same things and timelines and having technical debt,
Prioritization.
all those things. I'm sure they
And then
do.
they
I
say,
mean, it's an
Christmas is
industry.
coming. What can we do more? Yeah.
100%.
Wow. Okay. When we talk about some of like the buzzword that we talk about, like omnichannel, experience, what do you think about payments innovation works in this era, right? Play a role in all this digital transformation. You hear every day about this, right? Yeah. How do you see payments play? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've hit on it, but it's key that payment stays out in front of this, and it's not the limiting factor, but it's digitizing stores, right? We have a large retail footprint, and there's a balance. And I look at Amazon and Walmart battling, right? So Amazon started on the one end of the spectrum of completely digital originally, right? Walmart started in completely brick and mortar, and they're both battling to get to the other side, which just means there's some sweet spot in the middle of retail, digitized retail environment being relevant to both stateside and global consumers. So with that in mind, I think it comes down to how do we transform the in-store. I think on the e-com and m-com side, it's been driven pretty well over the last several years. I think we've made a lot of strides, but the store side is still lagging way behind. So I think it's how do we bring the capabilities, the web payment capabilities that have been developed and innovated upon into the store environment. That's step one, but what goes along with that is there's a really big challenge with a lot of brick and mortar retailers, especially in the U.S. Doesn't really apply to the rest of the world in a lot of senses, but in the U.S. we have this crazy interchange qualification structure for Visa, MasterCard, Amex, Discover, right? And within there, card-present payments are much lower in processing costs than the card-not-present transaction rates. If we bring all of that digital processing capability to in-store and transfer all of that over a card-present to a card-not-present transaction in a store, it can cost large merchants millions of dollars against their bottom line. So along with the technology side, there's a bit of an advocacy piece that is needed, at least in the U.S., in order to drive and equalize some of the inequity between, again, the traditional term is card present and card not present, but it should be consumer present or consumer not present, because those are better ways of describing what's going on.
But what you're saying is really not the payment innovation, but rather is like the digital experience innovation, right? I mean, so when you think about payments is like, that technology has been there for the longest time. Of course, cryptocurrency is another ballgame, but it's the digital experience, right, that you're talking about, like how you fuse them together, how to really understand the consumer. I mean, would you agree? I mean, Michel, you're at the back end plumbing, and do you believe that? How do you see
Well,
it?
I mean, I think the way I see this playing out is that we are slowly building the capability to remove cash from the equation. So cash is still king in many, many places around the world. But, it's increasingly becoming less so. There are places where it's happening faster, like China, and there are places where it's going to maybe take longer. And I think the US actually is not one of the leaders in that. So I think that's one aspect of innovation that is taking place where, we're getting better at being able to have secure transactions online. And because things are shifting online, then, more transactions are going to happen online and more of them are going to be secure using the, technologies, like 3DS 2.0 if you're talking about credit cards. I think those will make it possible for people to use cash less and to have card present rates even for online transactions because we can strongly authenticate the consumer. And I think the remaining innovation or the remaining question that is largely untouched at the moment is how do you make those anonymous transactions, right? Which is maybe the last hurdle or the last major hurdle to replacing cash altogether.
Because people do not want that anonymity.
Well, I mean, I think people like, true, right?
Yeah,
I mean, people
right,
like, again, we need to see what consumers want,
Right.
right? Because ultimately, I think that is the most powerful, push, right?
Yes, I'm for that.
People want to be able to do this anonymous stuff. And I think within reason, governments will have to allow them. So the technology will need to be developed that allows that to happen online using the tools that we have without losing or sacrificing the ability to do strong authentication and secure transactions. That still has not happened, right? I think that's like a big gap still. And it probably will be the last, I'm guessing, to be tackled because, only when we have everything else covered, people say, whoa, wait a minute, we want this too. But I think when that happens, that would really be the moment where we can say, you know what, you really don't need cash anymore. And, that will be an interesting moment.
Cashless.
Yes.
Less is more.
Yep.
So I know that Michelle, you don't like to predict, but maybe Pat can do some predictions.
Oh, that's not good either.
So next week, right? Okay, Black Friday. Anything? What is in your to-do list that you must do? Michelle, plumbing strategy.
Yeah, well,
Any plumbing strategy?
I
to
first
share?
of all I don't really do Black Friday myself. I think it's an interesting phenomenon, and as an immigrant to this country, I find it really fascinating. What's even more interesting is that it's starting to bleed over to other countries around the world. And that, I think, is a really powerful statement about how strong the U.S. economy and sort of culture is in other places, and how much people look to the U.S. for, an example. But the whole concept is really interesting, that on that day you have to go do or buy so much. I really think that I'm excited for generally for payments and the innovation that's happening in that field. But I think Black Friday is really interesting.
I'm interested to see how the volume of Black Friday actually turns out to be, because again, and we're watching the shift to m-commerce and e-commerce, which bleeds into Cyber Monday, which really bleeds into Cyber Week, and even beforehand. And we're starting to see almost this breakdown of shopping. It's still heavy. Don't get me wrong, right? Friday, and there's still peak transaction volume on Black Friday, absolutely, as we look at acquirers on the U.S. side, and that's when they're getting hammered. But it's starting to alter a little bit. So we're starting to see, I think everyone's trying to get their edge by either doing an approach, an early approach to Black Friday or a later approach to Cyber Monday. So I'm interested to see if retailers are starting to change their tactics a little bit and move away from those big days. Again, whether it's volume just sheerly in stores shifting to m-commerce or if it's shifting day by day, that's what I want to keep my eye out for.
So I remember in spring, in March, advertisement about like installment payment for preparing for Christmas. So I mean, I'm not in this, the analyst, as an analyst in this space. Do you think that the numbers in the Black Friday itself is really not the true representation of the magnitude of this, the purchase power?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Installment payments are a really, I would say, a rapidly growing and very competitive industry at the moment, right? Because they're opening up even further untapped purchasing power within the U.S. So it's a very interesting question. I don't think there's yet data to say, like, I would say installments are really growing in the last 18 months. So yet last year didn't see any noticeable change. It'd be interesting to see this year if we see a noticeable bump from that concept coming about. But I would agree with it that our clients are focusing pretty substantially on the concept of installment payments, quad pay, afterpay, Tyro, and they're all out there, right? So how can they leverage those services to increase their customers' buying power? Definitely a huge thing that we're looking at.
Thank you. I'd like to throw the question. I mean, any questions from the floor? Oh, so many. Good. Okay, I'll let the lady. Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you both. This was fascinating. I am not in this world, so I appreciate you giving this. My background is that I'm a user experience designer, and I know you don't want to predict. However, there is a statistic from the U.S. Census that states that in the year 2035, which is about 15 years from now, we'll have more people over the age of 65 than people under the age of 65. And so what I want to hear from both of you in regards to payment is you had both mentioned like adoption of these newer technologies. So how do you think that's going to thinking about the way that people pay today, how will we kind of adopt those future technologies as we age and people don't like change that much?
One topic that's a really good question, and one topic we are spending a substantial amount of just internal brain cycles on is there is a massive fragmentation of consumer segments that's going on. So there used to be pretty predictable consumer segments of, they want to pay in cash, they want to pay in check, they want to pay in credit card. Well, now all of those have even been blown up, right? So I think you highlight something of credit card users. For those over age of 65, they might still want to be engaging physically, right, at the point of sale. They want that face-to-face interaction, whereas a millennial that's very tech dependent is saying, I don't even know how to hold a conversation at a point of purchase. I'm a millennial, so I can make fun of millennials. Millennials.
I can make fun of millennials too.
Yeah, that's fair. But then I would say retailers need to be prepared, and it just goes back to the personalization concept. They need to be prepared not just to personalize offers and products to a user. They actually need to be prepared to personalize experiences to that user. So user experience will get extremely complex. Good field for, it's fantastic, right? But it's going to become extremely complex because you actually need to start tailoring how they want to be engaged and how they want to work through a checkout experience and a payment experience. That is something we're keeping and again, putting a lot of brain cycles around is you can't just have one user experience in the future. You need to have user experiences that support the various personas that are that are going through your checkout experiences. So that's the biggest thing I would highlight in response to that question is don't react. Any retailer who reacts and says, I'm going to keep up with my slowest buffalo is probably going to lose. They need to be able to, they need to be able to keep up with the pace of all the buffalo in the herd, which might mean different experiences for all of them.
That's very interesting. I think what I would add there is that if I look out, that far, of course, it's difficult to predict, but I think the technologies that we talked about, that I alluded to earlier, of making more and more transactions come online and basically be available on your device, and having smarter and smarter ways for your device to both authenticate you, Face ID, Touch ID, etc., and also communicate with you. Think of Apple Watch and those kinds of things. I think those will make it possible for people that don't really care for technology or don't have a lot of that savvy that younger people do to interact with technology and use it for payments. So I think today, if you look at people that were born before 1970, right, which is the people that will be 65 and older in 2035, probably most of them don't use Apple Pay or use their phone to pay anywhere, right? But I think as those technologies continue to evolve and improve and become more and more ubiquitous, I think it's going to become more and more likely that those people will eventually take the plunge. And maybe their grandkids are going to teach them or, whatever it may be. But I think that's the direction it's going to go. It's going to have to be a lot easier to use. I, as an industry person, right, of course, use all those technologies whenever I can because, I have to. There's, they exist, but they're difficult to use. They're not intuitive enough. And I think they're going to have to improve. But, there's still 16 years, so I'm optimistic.
We have time.
Karen? Yeah. And then Henry, yeah.
So I'm wondering, probably more for Patrick than for Michel, what amount of new technology like virtual reality, augmented reality, are retailers exploring? And if they are, where do payments fit in that experience?
Good question. I would say very dependent upon the vertical. And that really is driving where we're seeing the amount of interest, right? QSR, very little, right? I mean, they're really focusing on optimization of the supply chains, the consumer experience, delivery, et cetera. But on the, let's say, clothing retail side, or the furniture, home goods side, gaining tons of traction, right? I mean, there's obvious use cases for, and it's actually out there, right? Augmented reality use cases exist. IKEA's put out, uses of that, especially with the advancements in OEM technology within Apple devices and Google devices, is really bringing that to the forefront. How that is going to be integrated with payments, I think, is yet to be seen. I don't know if I have an answer on predicting where that'll go. I think it kind of comes back to that overall experience of how they're going to, it's yet to be known how they're going to integrate the AR and VR experiences into their overall checkout experience. And that's all on kind of the traditional purchase, get goods, leave, walk out of the store, get it delivered. I would say in the gaming and other industries, it gets a little bit more unique. And there's probably various shades of usage of payments within VR and AR that I personally am not as familiar with. But I would say on the retail side, it's yet to be seen how they're linked.
It's interesting. I think that also in the AR, VR, like if you can, I saw an app that you can actually like retrofit your, furniture and things like that. So, but this is actually the digital experience again, right? Yeah. It's not the payment.
Yeah, I don't have to go to IKEA to see how a furniture, a particular dresser is going to fit in my room. If they could do VR for it to put it together for me, that would be great. But other than that,
that would be nice.
That would be nice.
Okay, I'm going to give the mic to Henry.
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah.
So I think in one of the earlier panel, I mentioned how China has become literally from a cash society to a cashless society in literally 10 years. If you look at this country, where we live in this day, we're still using credit cards. We talked about this earlier, Patrick. Credit cards been using for the last 50 years. It doesn't seem like it's going away anytime soon, but who knows? But I know you guys don't like prediction, but let's say if you have to put a thinking cap on, there are just a lot of solutions and smart startups and even fintech trying to make things more digital. But I think there is more to it. If you look at Visa and MasterCard, I'm not sure they're in the room. Hopefully they're not. They're a very powerful group, including Amex. But just those two alone just really gobble much of the payment world. And then obviously for different reasons, they are getting a very tight grip on it. I think that the question is, maybe in 5 years, do you see them continue to have a tight grip? And then the second question is, if not, if yes, then what would sort of break this gridlock? before that innovation really inject into that space?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I'm not going to predict if they're going to have a tight grip or not, but I will just say this. The place where you can find a lot of innovation and get a foothold, if you will, is a place where things are not working well. And right now, things are working really well. If I take my credit card out, right, and I go to pay, it takes several seconds for me to complete a transaction, right? If I stand at the line and the cashier says, $20, right, I pull out my wallet, give the credit card, blah, 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 everything happens in 9-10 seconds, right? You can't really improve that all that much. I mean, what are you going to do? Make it happen just by thought? I mean, it's really difficult to think about how you can make it better. And I think that's not just the credit card companies being powerful and controlling. That's the credit card companies providing a really good service to consumers. And I think that's really where it's at. Now, as you think about it moving online, the question becomes, will they be able to continue and provide such a good user experience online? Early indications of the early attempts, if you look at 3DS 1.0, are not so good, right? So the early attempts to provide good, secure payments online were very, very clunky. But that's okay. You start somewhere and you can improve on that, right? The big question in my mind is, will the new standards, the 3DS 2.0 and 2.x, manage to live up to their promise of being much more smooth and secure and provide card-present rates online with the same smooth, sort of slick user experience that I have offline? If the answer is yes, then again, why would I change as a consumer, right?
I think the one area, I agree with everything Michel said. Just on top of that, one area that I keep an eye on is Apple and Google. Apple Card is a really interesting concept to keep in mind. So yes, it's riding the MasterCard rails today, right? So the adoption rate was pretty significant up front. The numbers were pretty substantial. Nobody knows Apple's and Google's plans, and again, Google hasn't gone there yet, but they're going to compete. They're going to get there. So it'd be interesting to see if Apple and Google start to challenge that duopoly of MasterCard and Visa. Again, they're frenemies today with Apple and MasterCard, but I could foresee potential that Apple disintermediates MasterCard out of that. And that would be I have no idea if that's in any plan anywhere, but if that happened, that would break the cycle of those two controlling a lot of the, at least in the US, a lot of the control that they have.
Just following that line, if that's the case, that's still a credit card, though. I know we're just making comments, right? But it's still the case, that's still credit card, though. I totally agree with what both of you said. I mean, it's all about, a lot of times, user experience, right? I mean, even though that's kind of painful from the merchant standpoint because they have to pay a couple of points. Yeah. But from a user standpoint, it's like, who cares, right? I mean, things are working out well. But it just, if things are going to be more digital, then we'll see what happens. But if I guess going back to the point, how is Apple going to play in that game? Because if yes, they're just triopoly, right? So it's a duopoly.
Well, but it opens up the game a little bit, right? I mean, we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, right? It's been, Amex, Discover, they've challenged a little bit, but in reality, it's been a duopoly, right? Well, it brings in another player, and maybe two more players, and it might bring that ability out there. That's what I was going after.
In the last few weeks, they again, it's going to have banking accounts, right? And that really is going into this whole thing in the financial services era, right?
Yeah, watching Venmo is the same thing, right? Yeah. Venmo is essentially just a bank account for me. I know people who just leave money in there, right? That's a bizarre concept, but they do it, and they love it, and they have the Venmo debit card, and they just move money around. So those concepts are going to start challenging, I think, if anything, they're going to challenge the construct of Visa, MasterCard control everything, which might then lead to some of the other changes. Again, I agree with Michel that I think it's the experience is working at the moment, if you think about it. And if it's working, we're making good stepwise innovation improvements and things like that, but in general, it's working. I'm waiting for the kind of the structural the control aspect to change, then I think we'd start to see other entrants and maybe some truly different experiences like what China has going on and things like that. Takes a long time in the U.S.
All right. Well, innovation needs patience. So with that said, I really appreciate two of you being in this panel. And thank you, everybody who stays to this late, right? We are now going to end this now. And we are going to have the reception at the 6th floor